Hello, welcome to World Affairs. Today we're talking about Danieri's Chapter 7, International Institutions. We're going to be looking at global and regional governance and the role that international institutions play in international affairs in the modern world. 3 points today. First of all, international institutions are a definition of something that includes states. It also includes the organizations that states use to interact with each other, things like the United Nations, as well as legal systems that define their interactions, such as treaties, conventions, other kinds of things. The United Nations, secondly, the United Nations is the most important international institution operating on the planet today, but it's not the only one. Third one, there are also regional organizations, international NGOs or non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations, even individuals or groups, cartels, terrorist organizations are what we would call international institutions who operate through similar frameworks as states do in the international arena. There are multiple levels of international or institutions and multiple types of them that the book talks about. First of all, constitutional. This is a type of institution that deals with, is based on governmental sovereignty, sovereignty of nations, self-determination, principles of non-intervention that have been around for centuries now. Fundamental level of international institutions has to do with treaties, international law, multilateral agreements, regimes, those kind of things. Regimes are a third thing that deals with law and institutions to enforce issue-specific international agreements. Things that deal with something like the missile technology control regime, which is an agreement between countries that produce missiles and missile technology, guidance systems, rocket propulsion, those kind of things, to not share that technology with other countries without agreements that all these countries know that what's happening and know why it's happening. International law is also an international institution itself. The international law, as we practice it nowadays, comes mostly from European practice and traditions, out of the constitutions of the United States, the Constitution of France, the legal system of Britain, those kind of things. The United Nations adopted its own Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It was drawn up by a committee of people from around the world who tried to spell out what should be the universal human rights: free speech, freedom to travel, freedom to own property, those kind of things. It was agreed to by the various members of the United Nations in 1948. Another part of international law comes from multilateral diplomacy, that is, agreements that many countries have signed on to, such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which deals with limiting the spread of nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. The Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention outlawed the building, stockpiling, and use of biological weapons and chemical weapons in war or for any other purpose against other human beings. These are agreements that have been negotiated by many countries. Countries have then signed on to the treaty once it was negotiated, and by signing on to that treaty, countries agreed to abide by the conditions of that treaty. Otherwise, they're in effect breaking the law. International agencies, such as the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the International Court of Justice, are charged with the responsibility of enforcing these international agreements and international law and doing something about keeping countries from violating their agreements. The book includes a listing of types and examples of various international organizations that you can take a look at, such things as international, regional, international governmental organizations, transnational actors like multinational corporations or NGOs are all listed there. Handy thing to look at. Let's talk about the United Nations for a minute here. The United Nations came out of the experience of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was created after World War I. It was the idea of President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, who in his speech of January 1918, spelling out the US aims in the war and his vision for post-war settlement, his 14th point was that the world should create an organization where countries could come together to negotiate their differences, to resolve their conflicts without going to war. At Versailles, the palace where the Treaty of Versailles was negotiated in 1919 after World War I. The leaders of the United States, France, Italy, and Great Britain all agreed to create this organization called the League of Nations. Wilson went back to the United States, took the treaty to the Senate. The US Senate rejected the treaty, saying that the US should not get involved in permanent diplomatic arrangements with other countries, and the League of Nations would limit American sovereignty in international affairs. And so the US never joined it. As a result, the League of Nations was not very effective and obviously failed in its primary goal of preventing a second world war, because in 1939, the World War II began. At the end of World War II, allies of the United States were invited to San Francisco to negotiate the creation of a successor organization now called the United Nations. The Charter of the United Nations, signed in San Francisco in 1945, spelled out four main purposes of the organization. You can see here: to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations between nations, to cooperate in solving international problems and promoting respect for human rights, and to be a center for harmonizing actions of nations. So the point of the United Nations when it was founded was primarily to prevent World War III. And it was to do that by overseeing a changing world in which the former European colonies would become independent and sovereign states, and also to deal with the conflicts that the great powers, United States, Soviet Union, France, England, China, had or might have in the future with each other. The United Nations is set up into six main bodies here. First of all, most importantly, is the Security Council. The Security Council has 15 members. 10 of these are rotating. They rotate every year or two. There are 5 permanent members of this body which have veto power over any decision the Security Council might make. The United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China can veto anything the Security Council does, which means then that for the Security Council to act, it's going to need the support of those 5 permanent members to do anything. And the idea was that this would prevent the United Nations from being used by any country or group of countries to overwhelm or to intimidate other countries. And this was a particular concern of the Soviet Union or the Russians, also the Chinese, who were outnumbered, felt outnumbered in the Security Council. The General Assembly now has 193 members. Started off with 49 who signed the charter in San Francisco. Each of these 190 members has 1 vote. In the General Assembly, there's no veto power. There are no permanent members of the General Assembly. Any country that applies to join can be admitted to the United Nations as a new member after a 2/3 vote in favor by the General Assembly. There are 2 organizations or members of the General Assembly, I should say, who are not states, that is the Holy See, the Vatican, and the Palestine Authority, who have observer status. That is, they come to the General Assembly meetings, they can speak there, but they don't have a vote. The General Assembly works on a majority vote. As I said, no vetoes for anybody. The third major part of the United Nations is the Secretariat. The Secretary General is the figurehead and leader of the United Nations. He is the chief executive of the organization, not quite like a president exactly, because the Secretary General depends upon the Security Council and the General Assembly for support for any decisions that he or she might make. The fourth one is the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. This is a council, permanent standing committee of the United Nations that deals with things like trade, investment, development, economic development, also deals with social issues, such things as poverty, women's rights, minority rights, education, child welfare, all kinds of things like that. The fifth one, the Trusteeship Council, was dissolved in the 1970s. It was created originally to oversee decolonization, the process through which the British, the French, and other European colonial powers gave up their empires, gave up their colonies, and allowed those colonies to become independent and sovereign nations. Finally, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, is an organization that is a voluntary method for countries to resolve conflicts. That is, if they have a conflict, say, over trade or a border dispute or how to deal with refugees or various kinds of things like that, they can go to the International Court of Justice for arbitration. And the arbitration means that it's a voluntary thing, but they're bound by the decision that's made by the arbitrators. And then they have to follow that decision. The UN plays a role in international security, particularly through the Security Council. And this was, the precedent for this was set in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. Korea was a country that was divided after World War II by the Soviets and the Americans. It had been under Japanese occupation. It was divided into two parts at the 38th parallel. 1950, the North Korean army crossed the border in an attempt to reunite South and North Korea into one country. Backed by the Soviets and the Chinese, North Korea launched this invasion. South Korea, supported by the Americans, decided to resist. And so the United States, in order to avoid a direct war with the Soviets and the Chinese, Soviets had nuclear weapons by this time, and went to the United Nations Security Council. And through some maneuvering, they were able to get a resolution passed by the Security Council declaring this to be an illegal, invalid invasion of a sovereign nation. And the Soviets happened to be out of the room at the time, and so couldn't veto the resolution. As a result, the United Nations sent peacekeepers to Korea, led by the United States and American commanders who stayed there for 3 years fighting a war. Eventually, in 1953, they decided to sign an armistice, which has been in effect ever since then. So technically, the Korean War is still going on, but the armistice has meant that the North Koreans and South Koreans have been an uneasy peace with each other ever since then. Part of the peacekeeping mission of the Security Council is a group called the White Helmets, which are soldiers from various member countries that are sent to places to basically serve as a block to prevent warring sides from attacking each other. These men and women wear white helmets. They don't carry weapons, and so they enter an area and basically stand between the two warring sides, defying them from attacking. So that's helping to calm down a situation, end the conflict, and that hopefully will lead to peace. Now, the Security Council also is engaged in peace enforcement in various places like Somalia and Yugoslavia, which fell apart in the 1990s, leading to a vicious civil war among the Serbians, Bosnians, Croats, and Kosovar. The United Nations was able to use the Security Council to send in troops and send in airplanes, etc., basically to force the Serbians to retreat and to end the conflict, and it established the peacekeeping troops in that area to maintain peace ever since then. The United Nations went through a kind of identity crisis when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, because it had been built in the Cold War, and much of what it had done for the first 45 years of its existence was trying to prevent World War III, a conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States and China and other allies. With the Soviet Union gone, the question was, do we still need a United Nations? And so Boutros Ghali, who was the Egyptian Secretary General at the time of the UN, put together a task force to come up with a new definition of the United Nations. And they came up with four main things here. Preventive diplomacy, that is, the UN should be involved in trying to prevent conflict and war between countries or within countries. They should be engaged in peacemaking, that is, trying to end conflicts and get sides to negotiate into their conflict and bring about peace. Peacekeeping, which is to occupy territories and keep the warring sides apart from each other and make sure that they follow the peace agreements and that conflict doesn't break out again. And then fourthly, post-conflict peace building, that is, rebuilding countries or places that had been in conflict, rebuilding cities, industry, schools, waterworks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so bring about a peaceful settlement, and so that and enforce that peace so that it continues to be a peaceful arrangement. In 2005, the United Nations further expanded its responsibility through what was called R2P, which was a pledge or vow of countries to take the responsibility to protect people in countries where there was civil war or the conflicts. Since 1945, there have been something like 126 military conflicts on this planet. So the UN has not succeeded in preventing war as such, but it has prevented World War III from breaking out, and it has worked to control and minimize these conflicts. Over the last 20 years or so, in the 21st century, about 95% of all the conflicts in the world have been civil wars, not wars between two countries, but rather wars between groups within a country, sometimes spilling across borders and engaging other countries, but they're not wars between two governments as such. And so we've got a situation in the last 20 years or so where some states have simply failed. Think Syria here, where the government no longer controls its territory, and is opposed by a large percentage of the population, but has been engaged in military efforts to control and eliminate anti-government forces in the country. And so the responsibility to protect agreement is says to countries that they have a responsibility to intervene in countries when their citizens and their citizenry is threatened by the government, when government's unable or unwilling to maintain, to do its basic job of protecting its citizen. The chapter also talks about other kinds of international organizations. I'll talk about just very briefly here that the first of these are the regional organizations. There are three big ones here. The European Union, which is probably the biggest, most famous, most powerful of all these, was created in 1992 through a treaty called the Maastricht Treaty that created a common economic market, a common currency, and started to eliminate trade borders, restrictions on travel, eliminate tariffs, all kinds of things like that. Now, the EU grew up to be 28 members. Eventually, it lost one of those. Now it's 27. The United Kingdom voted to withdraw from the European Union, and British voters thought that being in the EU somehow restricted their prosperity, and so they'd be much better off leaving the EU. It took years and years for them to negotiate the final exit from the European Union because it wasn't envisioned in the Maastricht Treaty, and so they had to invent a process. Eventually, the United Kingdom left the European Union. Ireland decided to stay in the European Union, so it did not leave with the rest of the British Isles. As a result, Britain's economy has been suffering terribly over the last few years. Shortages of gasoline and food and workers and all kinds of things like that. The oldest of the regional organizations is the Organization of American States, which was created in 1890, is headquartered in Washington, D.C. This combines all the countries of North America, as well as South and Central America and the Caribbean, who want to join it, into an organization that tries to deal with issues of trade and other kinds of things, and to reduce conflict between them. The Organization of African Unity was created in 1963, at the time when the European colonies in Africa were being decolonized and becoming independent countries. And as they became independent countries, they formed an organization to help them try to deal with Africa-wide problems of lack of economic development, dealing with resources, labor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 2002, the Organization of African Unity was renamed the African Union. Another kind of international institution are the international non-governmental organizations. These are non-governmental organizations, are organizations that are not sponsored by governments. They may get some support from governments, they may get some funding from governments, but they're independent of governments. They have an independent board, independent leadership. They make decisions independently of governments. Sometimes they operate in accordance with government wishes. Oftentimes they oppose government wishes. Think about various non-governmental organizations. For instance, Greenpeace is one of those. Greenpeace, which has been very active in the last few decades in trying to prevent whaling and stop degradation of the oceans, and has taken very militant stances on a number of things, trying to ram whaling ships and disrupt their activities in various kinds of ways that have brought them into conflict with governments that still support whaling or support the fishing boats that Greenpeace has gone after. Multinational corporations are a type of corporation that does business in multiple nations, that is across borders. A multinational corporation, something like Exxon Mobil or Apple, is an organization that might have headquarters in one place. They might have factories in another country. It gets raw materials from different countries. It has distribution networks across countries. Consumers are in different countries. These are the biggest corporations in the world tend to be these multinational corporations. They also have a profound effect on international relations because they control markets, because they control resources, because they control wealth. They can get involved in all kinds of things around the world. And so governments need to recognize and have to recognize their power for good or for bad in multiple kinds of ways. Other kinds of international institutions include individuals. Celebrities like Bono or Angelina Jolie have taken up causes dealing with poverty or debt, things like that. They've become UN ambassadors for the working for the United Nations around the world to sort of raise awareness of issues that are happening in various places and to bring about action by the UN and its member nations. Foundations and think tanks, things like George Soros and his the Democratic organization, Bill Gates and his foundation, are organizations that operate across national borders for various kinds of things, trying to promote democracy and democratic development, trying to promote transfer of technology, education, healthcare, various kinds of things like that. The book also mentions that cartels and terrorist organizations, things like drug cartels and terrorist organizations, are another form of international actor. They may be extra legal. They may not be working in the way that the UN would or other member states would like them to be, but they do operate across national borders. They have fundraising globally. Their organizations are often dispersed globally with training camps or operations, ships of their own, airplanes of their own, all kinds of things like that. They might be getting financial support from many different sources. And so they are also international organizations that affect international relations. All right, we're going to stop there. Thank you for coming today. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you soon. Take care. Good luck.